For 2 years, my children treated me like a liability they were carefully managing. They spoke over me at health appointments, monitored my prescriptions as though they were the professionals, referred to my decisions as concerns that needed to be addressed, and called their visits to me a commitment they were honoring. I was 69 years old and in reasonable health. I had a life insurance policy I had taken out 30 years ago, and the payout figure on that policy had apparently become the dominant variable in how my children thought about their relationship with me. I discovered this by accident on a Tuesday afternoon when I found a document in my study that had not been placed there by me. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer that same evening. But to understand why that discovery produced clarity rather than simply anger, you need to understand who I was before it, and what I had believed about my children before that belief was corrected. I had not been a suspicious father. I had been a generous one, present and consistent throughout the years, when presence and consistency are the things children most need from a parent. When you carry that self-understanding for a long time, and then a piece of information dismantles it completely, you do not simply feel betrayed. You feel the specific embarrassment of having been wrong for years about something you should have recognized sooner. The embarrassment passes. What remains is a precision of purpose that embarrassment, when it passes, sometimes leaves behind. If what I have described in these first sentences has touched something familiar, I want to invite you to stay and hear the full account. Subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already, and leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from. More people than you would expect have found themselves in exactly the position I found myself in, holding a piece of information they did not want, but could not unlearn, deciding what to do with what they now knew. This community exists for people who have been through that moment, and who want to understand they had every right to respond to it with intelligence and deliberateness. Thank you for being here. Now let me tell you exactly what I did, and why the morning my lawyer read the revised documents aloud was the morning that changed everything. My name is Harold. I am 69 years old. I spent 40 years as a commercial architect, designing retail and office developments across a region that expanded substantially during my working career. I built a competent practice, managed my finances carefully, and saved and invested with a patience that my profession, which requires thinking across long time horizons, had developed in me from the beginning. My wife Patricia died 4 years ago after a long illness during which we spent her final years simplifying our financial picture, making sure that whatever remained would be clear, manageable, and straightforward to eventually distribute. Our 3 children were the named beneficiaries of the estate: my eldest son Victor, my daughter Irene, and my youngest son Gerald. After Patricia died, the changes in my children's behavior began in ways that were small enough to appear unremarkable individually. Victor assumed a kind of informal advisory role over my personal affairs, accompanying me to appointments and speaking on my behalf at a financial meeting I had not authorized him to attend. Irene began calling daily, a frequency she had not maintained before Patricia's death, with conversations that had the texture of regular assessment rather than ordinary affection. Gerald asked me, 3 months after the funeral, whether I had updated my estate documents now that my circumstances had changed. He said planning early avoided complications. He had framed this as helpfulness. At the time, I accepted the framing. The life insurance policy had been taken out at 39, at Patricia's gentle insistence, when we had 3 young children and I was the primary earner, and the risks of something happening to me were real and practically significant. Over 30 years, the policy had grown. The current payout figure would represent a meaningful financial event for 3 adult children living comfortable but not wealthy lives. I did not think about this figure regularly. I had structured my circumstances so that I did not need to. What I failed to consider was how differently that figure might appear from a different vantage point, particularly from the vantage point of 3 people who were listed as beneficiaries, and who understood that the only condition required for receiving it was my death. My professional career had been built on precision and the ability to understand structural relationships. Architecture requires you to think about how individual elements relate to the whole, about what each component is bearing, and what would happen to the structure if it were altered or removed. The insurance policy was not something I had ever analyzed structurally in relation to my family relationships. It had simply been a provision made in a different phase of life for circumstances that had evolved substantially since the policy was written. When I finally applied professional analysis to the situation, the structural picture became very clear very quickly. The relationships I was observing were not primarily about my well-being. They were about the condition of the policy and the person holding it. The house I had lived in alone since Patricia's death was a property we had bought when Irene was 7 years old. We had renovated it several times across our marriage. Every room held specific history. The study where I worked in the evenings contained Patricia's architectural books alongside mine. She had never practiced professionally, but she had understood the field with the intelligence of someone who had spent 4 decades listening to a practitioner describe it. After she died, I kept her books on the same shelves where they had always been. I did not reorganize anything. The house as Patricia had known it was the house as I still lived in it. It was mine, and I intended to remain in it for as long as I chose to. Victor began organizing my prescriptions into labeled weekly dispensing boxes. He brought the boxes to my house without being asked, and insisted on managing the refill process himself. He said he was concerned about errors. I had not made errors. I had managed my own medications without incident for my entire adult life. I allowed the arrangement initially because resisting small gestures framed as care requires a degree of suspicion I was not yet comfortable applying to my own son. Then Victor mentioned in passing that he had spoken with my doctor about my cardiac monitoring schedule, and that they had agreed to increase the frequency of checkups. He had contacted my doctor without my authorization. My doctor had not informed me of this contact. I noted that carefully. Irene accompanied me to medical appointments and summarized my symptoms to the physician before I had finished speaking myself. The summaries contained information about my sleep patterns, my energy levels, and my daily functioning that she had gathered from the daily calls, and was presenting as established facts rather than interpretations of reported experience. I noticed that the picture she painted to the physicians was consistently somewhat darker than my own experience of my condition. When I mentioned this after one appointment, she said she was trying to ensure the doctor had a complete picture. I told her I was capable of providing that picture myself, as I had been doing for 69 years. She received this with the patient expression of someone who has already decided the patient's own account is less reliable than an observer's. Gerald arrived one afternoon with a printed folder of articles about estate planning. He had researched will structures, trust vehicles, asset transfer mechanisms, and the tax implications of various distribution approaches. He said he wanted to be helpful in ensuring my affairs were organized in a way that would minimize complications. He also disclosed, in the course of that conversation, that he had called my lawyer's office to inquire about the current status of my will and whether any recent updates had been made. My lawyer's office had not provided any information, which was correct and appropriate, but they had mentioned the call to me at our next scheduled meeting. When I told Gerald I was aware of the inquiry, he said he had only wanted to understand what provisions existed in case something happened suddenly. That phrase remained with me. The phrase, "in case something happened," was not incidental. It was the operational assumption underlying all 3 of my children's behavior across the previous 18 months. The medication boxes, the doctor conversations, the daily assessment calls, the estate inquiry, all of it was organized around the possibility of my death, which was not an abstract actuarial matter to them, but a specific financial event they were apparently tracking in relation to a document they were expecting to benefit from. I had been the last person in my immediate family to understand this about the people I had spent my life providing for. The understanding, when it arrived, was not dramatic. It was quiet and specific, and produced an immediate set of questions about what I was going to do with it. The Tuesday afternoon discovery happened while Victor was in my bathroom, and I was sorting materials in my study. In a drawer, I found a printed document I did not recognize. It was a summary from an insurance calculation tool, with my policy number at the top and the current payout figure prominently displayed. In the margins, in Gerald's handwriting, were the 3 children's names, the payout figure divided 3 ways, and a notation that read approximately 6 to 8 years based on current actuarial tables. I read the document twice. I placed it back in the drawer. When Victor returned, I said nothing about what I had found. I made conversation about his recent work. When he left, I called Catherine, my lawyer, and asked whether she had time to meet me on Monday morning. The full pattern assembled itself with unmistakable clarity after I found the actuarial document. The medication management had never been about medication safety. The doctor consultations had never been about health advocacy. The daily calls had never been about ordinary family affection. The estate inquiry had never been about practical planning. Each element was a component of a structure built around the insurance policy and its payout condition. My children had been maintaining what I could only describe as an asset monitoring operation, in which I was the asset being monitored. When I described the sequence to Catherine at our Monday meeting, she said the pattern had a name, and was not unusual in her experience of estate matters involving elderly clients with significant insurance provisions. She said we should begin reviewing everything immediately. Catherine had represented me for 16 years. She had managed Patricia's estate process and several property transactions before that. She listened to the complete account without interrupting. When I finished, she said she could see the picture clearly and asked whether I had the actuarial document still available. I had brought it to the meeting. She photographed it and placed the photograph in my file. She said the document, combined with the pattern I had described, suggested a level of financial preoccupation with my estate that she would want to address properly. She recommended beginning with a full review of the will, the insurance beneficiary designations, and any other financial documents where designations or provisions had not been formally reviewed since Patricia's death. We scheduled 2 full sessions. The review Catherine and I conducted revealed several places where documents reflected old assumptions rather than current realities. The insurance policy was the most significant item. Beneficiary designations on life insurance policies can be changed by the policyholder at any time during their lifetime, without notification to existing beneficiaries, and without any legal challenge available to those whose designation is altered. I was the policyholder. The policy was entirely mine. Patricia had been the original co-beneficiary, and the current designation had defaulted to the 3 children after her death, without ever being formally reviewed in the context of a deliberate decision. Catherine explained the options available to me. I told her what I had decided before she had finished explaining the first one. The new beneficiary for the insurance policy was an organization dedicated to architectural preservation that Patricia had followed closely throughout her life. She had attended their lectures, contributed financially in modest amounts, and spoken about their work with the enthusiasm she reserved for things she found genuinely worthwhile. Naming this organization as the primary beneficiary of the policy felt like 2 things simultaneously: a direction of the resource toward purposes I believed in, and a form of posthumous honoring of someone whose values had informed my own for 4 decades. Catherine noted the designation carefully and confirmed it was complete, unambiguous, and legally effective immediately upon filing, which we completed before the meeting ended. The will revision required 2 full sessions with Catherine, and an additional session reviewing the final draft. The new document was built from the ground up rather than amended, reflecting a deliberate decision to reconsider the entire structure rather than adjust individual provisions. The 3 children remained in the document, but in proportions that reflected the relationships as they actually existed, rather than as I had previously chosen to characterize them. Several charitable organizations were named as primary beneficiaries. Specific bequests were made to two friends who had been present and consistent throughout Patricia's illness, in ways that had mattered. The document was witnessed, notarized, and filed on a Thursday morning. I went home afterward and made lunch without difficulty. I said nothing to my children for several months after the revisions were completed. I continued my ordinary life. Victor continued bringing the medication boxes, and I accepted them pleasantly. Irene continued the daily calls, and I participated in them with my usual engagement. Gerald continued bringing estate planning research, and I thanked him for it. None of them knew that the documents they had been calculating their futures around had been revised, properly executed, and filed with my lawyer's office on a Thursday in March. I did not feel a need to announce this. The revision existed. Its effects would become apparent when they were intended to become apparent. In the meantime, I was living my life with a clarity that I found, for the first time in more than 2 years, genuinely peaceful. I decided the disclosure should happen at a time I chose rather than incidentally. I called each of my 3 children and asked them to come to Catherine's office on a Tuesday morning, saying only that we needed to review some estate documents together. Victor arrived in a suit, which told me he had prepared for a scenario he had anticipated. Irene brought a notepad. Gerald arrived with a folder, which told me he had assembled materials in advance. Catherine greeted them with professional warmth, offered coffee, and began reading the documents in the measured voice she used for all such readings. The room was quiet, with the quality of attention that occurs when people believe what is being read is what they expected to hear. Catherine read the will first. The language was clear and the provisions were unambiguous. The proportional distribution, which was substantially different from the equal distribution the previous will had contained, became clear as the reading progressed. The 3 children heard their own names in provisions that did not reflect the figures they had been calculating. The charitable organization provisions occupied significant portions of the document. Catherine read all of it without pause or editorial comment, which was the professionally appropriate approach, and the one I had discussed with her in advance. When she finished the will, she moved directly to the insurance beneficiary change and read that document in full as well. The Architectural Preservation Organization's name appeared where each of them had presumably expected their own names to appear. The silence that followed the reading had a particular quality. It was the silence of people processing the difference between what they had expected and what they had heard. Victor asked, after a long pause, whether the documents were final. Catherine said they were valid legal documents, executed by a competent adult, and that there were no grounds for challenge she could identify. Irene asked whether there had been undue influence. Catherine said she had represented me for 16 years, and that every revision had been initiated by me without external pressure of any kind. Gerald said nothing for several minutes. When he finally spoke, he addressed the wall behind Catherine's head and said he had not intended things to be the way they seemed. I told him I understood what he had intended. I also told him I had read the actuarial table. What followed the disclosure meeting was not a reconciliation and not a rupture. It was something more complex and less easily categorized. Victor came to see me twice in the following months with what he intended as apologies, but which contained, in both cases, substantial explanations of why his behavior had been driven by concern rather than calculation. I heard him out on both occasions without interruption. The will reflected my understanding of our relationship, and my understanding had not been altered by his explanations, which were sincere, but did not change what the actuarial document had shown me about the calculations that had been running alongside his expressions of concern. Irene's conversations were more honest and more uncomfortable. Gerald called more regularly than before, and his questions had a different quality. He was asking about my life rather than my arrangements. In the months before the disclosure, my children had continued their patterns as though nothing had changed. The medication boxes arrived weekly. The daily calls continued. Gerald brought an additional folder of estate planning materials at our last dinner before I called them to Catherine's office. The continuity of their behavior told me something about how fully they had committed to the structure they had built around me. They were maintaining it with the consistency of people who believed the investment was still operational, and the asset was still unaware. The asset was aware. The asset had been aware since a Tuesday afternoon in my study, and had been conducting its own operations since the Monday morning phone call to Catherine that followed. What I found most revealing about the period between the discovery and the disclosure was not anything my children said or did. It was what they did not ask. In 3 months of continued contact, not one of them asked whether I had noticed anything unusual about my own accounts or documents. Not one of them asked whether I had been reviewing my financial arrangements recently. Not one of them mentioned the insurance policy directly. They were operating as though the calculation were invisible to me, as though the only perspective from which my situation was being analyzed was theirs. That assumption, made by 3 people who had been interacting with me my entire adult life, told me everything I needed to know about how they had come to think about who I was and what I was capable of understanding. The disclosure meeting was the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The phase that had been running since shortly after Patricia's death, in which my children managed a relationship with me organized around a financial event they were anticipating, was over. The phase that followed was more honest and more uncomfortable, and contained possibilities that the previous one had not. Victor has had to reckon with having been the most organized and most persistent of the 3 in what they had been doing. Irene has had to reckon with having used her daily access to my life as an intelligence-gathering operation she did not describe to me accurately. Gerald has had to reckon with having researched and contacted my lawyer in relation to an estate he had no authority to inquire about. The charitable organizations that now hold the primary beneficiary positions are doing work that Patricia and I believed in across our professional lives. The Architectural Preservation Organization has acknowledged the designation in a letter that sits in my study alongside Patricia's books. The other organizations named in the will have received advance notice of planned bequests and have responded with the practical engagement of institutions that understand what such provisions mean for their future capacity. Knowing that what I accumulated across a working life will be applied to purposes I chose deliberately, rather than distributed as the actuarial calculation my children had been maintaining expected, is a form of satisfaction I did not expect to feel this clearly at 69. I continue to live in the house Patricia and I shared. I continue my professional relationships with Catherine and with the financial advisor who has managed my investments for many years. I walk in the neighborhood Patricia and I walked in together. I attend the architectural preservation lectures she had introduced me to, and which I now attend in my own right as a committed supporter. The medication boxes Victor brought are no longer delivered. I manage my own prescriptions as I always did before they began arriving. The daily calls from Irene have reduced in frequency and increased in honesty. Gerald calls and asks about my current projects, not my estate. These changes are not identical to repair. They are something more tentative, more earned, and more real. What I did was simple and entirely legal and within my complete authority as a competent adult. I changed beneficiary designations on a policy I owned and revised a will that bore my name. No one was harmed by these choices. No assets were removed by any external party. What changed was the intended destination of what I had accumulated, directed now toward purposes I chose rather than toward people whose primary interest in my continued existence had been revealed to me on a Tuesday afternoon in an actuarial calculation written in Gerald's handwriting. The document was my response to their document. It was prepared by professionals, executed properly, and reflects an accurate understanding of my situation, rather than the one I had been maintaining before the Tuesday discovery corrected it. Catherine and I meet once a year now to review the documents and ensure everything remains current and accurately reflects my intentions. She has described our most recent review as straightforward, which reflects the clarity with which the documents were prepared. The will is as I intended it. The insurance designation is as I intended it. The estate that Patricia and I built over 40 years of careful work will go where I have determined it should go, according to choices made by a competent adult with a full understanding of the relationships and values that inform them. I find this situation, if I am being accurate about it, entirely peaceful. There is a specific quality of peace that arrives when you stop maintaining an understanding of your circumstances that is no longer accurate. I am 69 years old, and I made significant decisions about my estate in response to information I did not seek but could not ignore. The decisions were legal, deliberate, and informed by 16 years of professional guidance from a lawyer I trust completely. The life insurance policy will support the work of an organization Patricia cared about. The estate will do the work I believe it should do. My children have the relationships with me that the truth of our situation currently supports, rather than the relationships maintained by assumptions that an actuarial document made impossible to sustain. Before you go, I have one question. If you discovered that the people closest to you had been viewing your life through the lens of what it would eventually be worth to them, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them directly? Tell me in the comments below.